This is Just a Few Questions. I'm Marc Sims. My guest is David Masciotra. He's the author of the book, David, I watched it earlier, Exurbia, right? Like suburb, Exurbia Now, right?
Yes, that's
Man,
exactly it.
I'm looking at the fine book of what now? Welcome to the show, David Masciotra. I'm looking at the fine book and I got it in my hot little hands right here. So tell us a little bit about your book. And the first question is, of course, what is Exurbia?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mark. I really enjoy the show, and I'm a listener, so I'm glad to today participate in the conversation. So thanks for your question, and it's one as you can imagine, I've had to answer repeatedly since the book came out in April. Exurbia is the area on the fringes of cities, so it's beyond suburbia, and yet it's not quite rural. So the key factors to measure the difference between suburbia and exurbia are distance and density, as in population. So exurbia typically has greater distance from the city, whether it's Chicago or Philadelphia or Atlanta. And then exurban towns have fewer people than suburban towns. Now, the significance of it is that the subtitle of my book is The Battleground for American Democracy, because Exurbia is where Donald Trump's support is the highest. His electoral returns in Exurbia in 2016 and 2020 were off the charts. The most rabid right-wing psychotic members of Congress, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matthew Gaetz, Jim Jordan, Lauren Boebert, represent districts that are predominantly exurban. And the profile of exurbia is quite different from how the mainstream media presents the average Trump supporter. The mainstream media likes to narrow the focus onto to use a pejorative term, the redneck vote in the little red hats, living out in, as they would imagine, the trailer parks. But what we find when we look at exurbia, and what I depict and describe in the book, drawing on research, my own journalism, and my own personal experience, because I live in northern Indiana, the suburbs of Chicago, but close enough to exurbia that I could take a little drive over for the purpose of researching and writing the book. What we find is that in exurbia, median household wealth is actually higher than median household wealth more broadly for the United States. And these are planned communities where real estate developers enter into a largely undeveloped area, build up subdivisions, strip malls, and create a suburban-like atmosphere and environment for people who are in the later stage of white flight, looking to flee the suburbs because now suburbs have become more diverse, and also looking to create a like-minded cluster of voters, citizens, churchgoers, etc. So what we find is most megachurches, especially of the right-leaning variety, are in exurbia, and these places also lack more organic sources of community and recreation. There aren't many parks, there aren't many public programs, not even walkable spaces. In fact, many of the residential areas don't even have sidewalks. So to put a button on it, you have people who are driven into exurbia because they dislike and resent suburbia gaining more black residents, Latino residents, Asians. They dislike suburbia becoming more politically liberal, friendlier to gays, and perhaps more secular. And so they flee into those areas based on a politics of paranoia and isolation, and then they recreate that situation of paranoia and isolation within their exurban towns. So that makes them ripe for the picking for a demagogue like Donald Trump, who encourages the fear of immigrants and encourages the hostility towards social liberalism. And my book, just to conclude, my book, as I was saying, it's really a hybrid of journalism, political analysis, but also personal writing, because I've lived in this area my entire life, the suburbs of Chicago and the small towns of northern Indiana.
Well, you grew up in Lansing, Illinois, I believe, right?
Yes, Lansing, Illinois
And
is where
I
I grew up.
I grew up not too far in the south side of Chicago all my life, so we're familiar with these areas you're talking about. And actually gone through Crown Point a few times. Another story. But here's the question, David: what is anything wrong? Is anything wrong with moving to a town or living in a town where people look and think alike?
That's a great question, because it's an honest question and it's a complicated question, and it's one no one else has asked me. And I would say that the answer isn't binary. I wouldn't answer that question with a yes or no, because if we study American history, we know that ethnic enclaves are a major part of any major or mid-sized city in the United States. All you got to do is go into Chicago, and there are still areas that are predominantly Puerto Rican, predominantly Mexican, predominantly black. There's Chinatown in Chicago, just as is in many other cities. My ancestors came here from, on my mother's side, came here from former Yugoslavia, and they created little Serbian neighborhoods in the south side of Chicago. But then on the other side, we know that our country practiced vicious redlining, mainly against aspiring black homeowners and business owners, but it also affected Latinos in different parts of the country. We know that police brutality was often used as a border keeping tactic to keep black people out of certain towns that had the name sundown towns, because it was understood if you're black, you don't want to be in that town after the sun goes down, because you could get arrested on trumped up charges, beaten, or in some cases even lynched, depending on the time and place. So there's a very dark history to the clustering as well, to the like-minded sociology. So in order to answer your question, it's important to determine a couple of factors. So first of all, what's the motive for living with people who look like you and think like you and have a similar cultural background? Is it to create a sense of solidarity and community, as my ancestors did from Serbia and as people in Chinatown do now? If that's the case, then it could be something quite beneficial and have great social and economic efficacy. But if the motive is simply to exclude others, which is often the case in communities that develop because of white flight, and the people who develop those communities are going to use a variety of tactics, formerly brutal, but now much more subtle, to enforce the exclusion of others, then that clearly becomes an act of bigotry manifesting in injustice and inequality. And furthermore, I would say, what happens, what is the motive, and then also expanding on my second part of that, what is the technique for creating and maintaining that community? So if the technique is merely, we are going to shop at stores owned by people who go to the same church as us or who have some family connection to us, we're going to choose to spend our money more strategically to keep our money in the community, that's not objectionable at all. And again, that could be quite beneficial from a communal standpoint. But if the tactics and techniques are to use the arm of the state against people, or to use tools of economic apartheid So refusing to grant a loan to a aspiring black homeowner or an aspiring Latino business owner, then it becomes a method of perpetuating the very injustices and inequalities that trouble the American dream and have troubled our history up until the present. So to conclude, there's potentially nothing wrong with living in a neighborhood with people who look like you and think like you and have a similar cultural background and set of values. But there's potentially everything wrong with it if the motive is based upon exclusion and hoarding, attempting to hoard wealth and power.
We all know, as they say, the experts say, race is a social construct. Okay, I got that social construct down. But when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, the white-black, neighborhood line, racial line, whatever you want to call it, was only like a mile and a half from my house. And it was very stark. You crossed the line, the neighborhood, whatever the street was, boom, it was all white, all day and all night. And so I sort of understand. I didn't understand it as a child, of course. But I understand it now. You can't live. You want to keep your racial identity, your pureness, whatever. Because, back in the day, I don't know, it's not like this so much now. But back in the day, I understand, because if you live together, you're going to have some mixed race babies. You're going to have some miscegenation. Right. Miscegenation, that's a fear. And of course, the other fear is probably even worse. The fear you have to share power and share resources. So here's the question, David. Exurbia, the last frontier of conservative whiteness.
Yeah, that's one of the arguments that I make in the book, that when white conservatives looking to maintain their domination of power, wealth, and resources began to lose their grip on the cities, they moved to the suburbs. And for decades, beginning in the 70s up until about the late 1990s, they were able to maintain a power base in suburbia. That began to change around the late 90s. The suburbs, because of the victories of the civil rights movement and various other social movements that invested more power and opportunity in non-white citizens, suburbia started to become more diverse. Because you had a larger black middle class, you had a larger Latino middle class, you had a growing Asian middle class. And white conservatives began to lose their grip on the suburbs of major cities. They still have that on the suburbs of smaller cities like Peoria or Grand Rapids, Michigan. But in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Atlanta, increasingly, Los Angeles, the politics began to more closely resemble the politics of urban areas, and the economic dynamics began to more closely resemble the economic dynamics of urban neighborhoods. So Exurbia is the last refuge of the reactionary politics of exclusion that white conservatives are attempting to enforce. So at the local level, that means that exurbs typically don't have public transit because you want to keep certain people out, low-wage workers. Exurbia typically, as I was saying earlier, their residential areas don't even have sidewalks. And I quote city planners in my book describing brazenly how if a neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks, certain people are going to feel discouraged to enter. And people who live in Exurbia, they typically elect like-minded people to the city council, the school board, so that they can politically enshrine and even calcify their ideology. Nationally, it graduates to the state and national level because, as I was saying at the top of our interview, exurban voters support Donald Trump and candidates who think like Donald Trump. They support people like Lauren Boebert and Jim Jordan and congressional representatives who think and behave like they do. So it is all in the name of enlarging and advancing an agenda of exclusion and maintaining a stranglehold on the power, wealth, and resources that they currently control.
Well, the show is almost over, and first I got to thank you for being my guest, and you're going to end the show. And and I got to apologize for messing up the name of the book. I was, Exurbia, and I think I was thinking about Exorbia, which is a brand new brand of adult diaper I saw the other day. And,
Yeah, I hope you're the only one
okay.
who makes that mistake.
Okay, so maybe that's why I got it all mixed up. So tell. I know you're a professor, but tell folks.
I promise the readers that I'm not full of shit. That the book has nothing to do with diapers.
Very good, Professor. All right, I wish I had a drum to give you a little rim shot. So in the show, and to really explain to people who live in an Exurbia town or close to Exurbia town, or we live in a state with these Exurbias, we have to go, whether they like it or not, full stop with the Democratic Party, and we have it out in the primaries, and then we go stand and go with the party line in the general election. So what I'm saying, people should not stay at home in these, if they have towns or near a town, Exurbia type town. What do you think? And end the show with your lecture. Go right ahead.
That's another great point, Mark, and that's something that I do my best to emphasize, I hope thunderously, in the book, is that dating back to the fall of Richard Nixon, when Richard Nixon had to resign in disgrace, the right-wing movement of the United States was at one of its lowest points of popularity. So all of these political strategists, one of whom had the name Richard Viguerie, he was perhaps the most influential, and even though I disagree with his agenda, the most effective and wisest among them. He said what we need to do, because we're not going to build much national power right now, because we're at a low point. So what we need to do is we need to start building local power. If we get people elected to offices like city council in a small suburb, or county sheriff, or the mayor of a small city, we can then begin to network all of those people to create something like a right-wing army on the march for us, who can then coalesce to support candidates for governor, senator, and eventually president. And not only coalesce in terms of how they vote, but coalesce their resources and coalesce their ability to have influence over their voters and their towns and their counties. Whereas Democrats have, much to their detriment, typically neglected local politics. And if one cares about the future and potential for multiracial democracy in this country, where we all have more opportunities for greater prosperity, and we all have the full-fledged enjoyment of our civil rights and protections under the law, we can't say that we're only going to vote at the national level, but we have to vote at the national level, we have to vote at the state level, and we have to vote at the local level, whether we live in Chicago, a suburb of Chicago, or an exurb of Chicago, or any other city. And for better or for worse, I mean, there are objections that I have to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has gone so far off the trail and has become a personality cult surrounding Donald Trump, who, if you read his team's plan, should he win re-election, it's called Project 2025. In their own language, they admit it is to create a unitary executive who has the power to circumvent the courts and Congress. In other words, it's a dictatorship. So the Democratic Party, for all of its flaws right now, is the last bulwark, the last measure against this authoritarian march of the right wing. And if you want a democracy in the United States and you want at least the opportunity for equality, you better support the Democrats and try to make the Democratic Party better rather than checking out and, through the consequence of apathy, allowing people to take power who don't respect our democracy and don't respect the diverse population that our democracy aspires to represent.